Have you ever stared at the ceiling at 3 a.m., waiting for sleep that never comes? The silence feels heavy. The night stretches like it has no end. These moments. Thoughts whisper louder than any voice. Tonight, we step into that silence. This is not just a story. This is the longest night of your life. The longest night of silence. The night was quiet, too quiet, as if the entire world had decided to sleep except one restless soul. Arjun lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above him. Each rotation felt like a countdown to something that would never arrive. The room smelled faintly of old books and the leftover tea he had forgotten on the wooden desk hours ago that he turned on his side, pulling the thin blanket over his shoulder, hoping that the weight of it would bring comfort. It didn't. His mind was heavy with thoughts, yet none of them made sense. He tried to close his eyes, to surrender himself to the rhythm of sleep, but his eyelids felt like locked doors without a key. The night outside his window stretched endlessly, and the street lights glowed with a pale orange light that reminded him of old memories. Memories he wasn't ready to face. The ticking of the wall clock grew louder with every passing second. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It was like a cruel reminder that time was moving, even when he wasn't. He sat up on the bed, rubbed his face with his hands, and let out a deep sigh that echoed in the silence of his room. He walked toward the window and pushed it open. A cool breeze entered, carrying the faint sound of a dog barking in the distance. The streets were empty, the shadows long and stretched like ghosts on the pavement. Arjun wondered how the world could feel so alive during the day and so painfully still at night. His eyes wandered to the half-finished novel lying on the table. He picked it up, turned to the page where he had left off, and began to read. The words felt heavy, like stones he had to lift one by one. His mind drifted away from the story and back into the hollow silence of his thoughts. Why did nights feel so endless when you were awake? Why did sleep feel like a stranger who never came when you needed it most? He tried lying down again, pulling the pillow close, closing his eyes tighter this time, as if he could force sleep to come. But the only thing that arrived was the sound of his own breathing. Hours passed like days. The clock on the wall struck midnight, then one, then two. Arjun imagined the rest of the world lost in dreams, floating in a world of color and light, while he was trapped in the darkness of his own wakefulness. He picked up his phone, scrolled through meaningless posts, watched videos that made no sense, and yet he couldn't stop. His eyes burned, his head felt heavy, but still, sleep refused to visit. He turned off the phone and stared at the ceiling once more. The fan spun slowly. The shadows on the wall danced like silent companions mocking his misery. He began to count numbers. 1, 2, 3, hoping that boredom would finally win and pull him into unconsciousness. But it didn't. The numbers stretched endlessly, like the night itself. Outside, a faint glow appeared on the horizon. Morning was coming, but to Arjun, it felt like a defeat. He hadn't slept, not a single moment. The birds began to chirp, breaking the heavy silence of the night. He lay still, eyes open, realizing that the longest night of his life had ended not with dreams, but with exhaustion. As the first rays of sunlight touched his face, Arjun finally closed his eyes, surrendering to the sleep that had played hide and seek with him all night. Second story whispers of an empty night. The night was heavy with silence. Ian lay on his bed, his body tired but his mind running wild like a restless river. He had tried everything, closing his eyes, breathing slowly, even counting backwards from 100. But sleep stayed far away, like a stranger ignoring his desperate calls. The ceiling above him looked endless, a blank white canvas where his thoughts began to paint pictures he didn't want to see. Memories he had buried long ago crawled back to the surface. The laughter of old friends, the sound of a voice he could no longer hear, the promises he once believed in, they all returned, whispering to him in the dead of night. He sat up and stared at the clock on the wall. 2 in the morning. The ticking was soft, almost soothing, but also a cruel reminder that time never waits for anyone. He rubbed his face, walked to the window, and looked outside. The street was empty, the lampposts glowing like lonely sentinels guarding a world that had long gone to sleep. The shadows of trees danced in the wind, like dark figures performing a silent play. Ian turned back into the room. It felt smaller than before, the walls closing in, the air thick with boredom. He opened a book, read 2 pages, then closed it again. The words didn't stick. They were like sand slipping through his fingers. He picked up his phone, scrolled through endless photos and meaningless messages. Nothing felt enough to silence the emptiness. The hours passed slowly, painfully. He made himself a cup of tea in the kitchen, its warmth a temporary comfort against the coldness of the night. He stood by the counter, staring at the steam rising from the cup, wondering why nights like these existed, nights that swallowed peace and spat out silence. Back in bed, he lay still, his eyes fixed on the faint shadow of the curtains swaying in the breeze. The world outside slept soundly, wrapped in dreams, while he lay awake, prisoner to his own thoughts. By the time the first light of dawn touched the sky, his eyes burned with exhaustion. He smiled bitterly, because now, when the world would wake, he would finally fall asleep. Third story, the endless midnight. The city outside was silent, wrapped in the velvet darkness of midnight. Yet Armand lay wide awake. His bed, though soft, felt like a cage. The pillow beneath his head was warm on one side, cold on the other, but neither brought him comfort. The air was still, except for the lazy hum of the ceiling fan slicing through the emptiness above him. He stared at it, following the slow, hypnotic rotation as if it might pull him into sleep. But the more he stared, the more awake he became. He turned to the clock on the wall. The hands moved with painful patience. 12:47 a.m. The sound of its ticking filled the room like whispers in a hollow cave. Armand sighed heavily and closed his eyes again, forcing his body into stillness, hoping that pretending to sleep would eventually lead to real sleep. But his mind had other plans. Thoughts came crawling in, small ones at first, then larger, louder, heavier. What was he doing with his life? Why did everything feel so meaningless? He had questions, but no answers. And in the darkness, these questions grew teeth. He turned over, pulling the thin blanket tightly across his shoulders. The fabric smelled faintly of laundry soap, a small comfort in a world of restlessness. But comfort wasn't enough tonight. He opened his eyes and stared at the faint glow of moonlight slipping through the half-closed curtains. Dust particles floated lazily in the beam, dancing like tiny ghosts. Armand's gaze followed them until they disappeared into the shadows of the room. He imagined what the world outside looked like now. Empty streets stretching like rivers of darkness, lampposts standing tall like forgotten soldiers, the occasional sound of a distant dog barking into nothingness. With a deep breath, he sat up. His throat felt dry, so he swung his legs off the bed and walked barefoot across the cool floor to the kitchen. The light from the refrigerator spilled into the darkness as he opened it. Inside, everything looked colorless, like props in a dream. He grabbed a bottle of water and took a long sip, feeling the cold liquid trickle down his throat. It was refreshing, but it didn't ease the hollow ache in his chest. He walked back into his room, phone in hand this time. Its glow pierced the darkness, a cruel reminder of the world that never sleeps. He scrolled aimlessly, pictures, videos, words, all blurring into one another. People laughing, smiling, living, while he sat alone in the dim light, searching for something he couldn't name. After an hour of this, the emptiness only grew heavier. He placed the phone aside and tried reading a book. The story should have pulled him in, but tonight the words were lifeless, scattered like dead leaves. He read the same paragraph 5 times and still couldn't remember a single sentence. Frustrated, he closed the book and lay back down, staring at the ceiling once more. The fan spun slowly, casting soft, shifting shadows on the walls that he closed his eyes and began counting backward from 100. 99, 98, 97. His voice was silent, but the rhythm played in his head like a slow drumbeat. Still, sleep didn't come. Instead, his mind dragged him into memories he had buried deep. The first heartbreak, the day his father left, the job he lost. They all paraded before him like cruel reminders of how far he had fallen from the dreams he once held. Time became meaningless. He checked the clock again, 3:12 a.m. The night stretched like an ocean with no shore. He wondered if anyone else in the world felt this way right now. Awake, lonely, adrift in a sea of silence, he sat by the window, looking at the street below. A single streetlight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the empty pavement. Somewhere, far away, a car engine roared briefly, then faded into the distance. Everything felt distant, unreachable, like the stars scattered across the sky above. Armand let his thoughts wander to the future. Would life always feel like this? A string of meaningless days tied together by nights of hollow wakefulness? He tried to shake the thought away, but it clung to him like a second skin. When the first light of dawn appeared, soft and pale against the horizon, Armand felt no relief. The night was ending, but his exhaustion was deeper than sleep could cure. He lay down one last time, eyes burning, heart heavy, as the sun rose to greet a world that felt colder than ever. Sleep came then, not as a blessing, but as an afterthought, stealing over him like a thief too late to matter. Fourth story. The night that never slept. The night began like any other, quiet, uneventful, wrapped in stillness. But for Kabir, it was the beginning of an endless stretch of time that refused to move forward. He lay on his bed, staring at the faint cracks on the ceiling, the fan rotating lazily above him. making a low humming sound that was almost hypnotic, yet oddly irritating. Sleep should have come by now. It should have swept over him like a tide, pulling him under, drowning the weight of his thoughts. But instead, he was wide awake, his mind a crowded room filled with voices that wouldn't stop talking that he rolled over and buried his face in the pillow, breathing in the faint smell of detergent mixed with something he couldn't quite name, maybe loneliness. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, each second dropping like water into an empty well. 11:58 p.m. The night was young, yet it already felt ancient. Kabir closed his eyes, willing himself to drift away, but the darkness behind his eyelids only gave his thoughts more room to roam. They wandered to places he avoided during the day, old mistakes, mischances, the people who walked out of his life without warning. He hated how the night had the power to strip him bare, to peel away all the distractions and leave him facing truths he didn't want to see. He sat up, his breath heavy, and ran a hand through his messy hair. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a street lamp filtering through the curtains. He walked toward the window and pulled them apart, staring outside. The street was empty, drenched in a pale orange light. A single dog roamed lazily across the road, sniffing at nothing, as if even it had nowhere to be. The city felt dead, and yet Kabir knew behind those closed doors, thousands of people were dreaming, escaping into worlds of color while he was trapped in one that felt drained of everything. He sighed and walked back to the bed, picking up his phone. The screen lit up, harsh and bright against the darkness. Notifications blinked like tiny stars, meaningless fragments of a world that never slept. He scrolled endlessly, photos, videos, strangers pretending to be happy, people chasing things they would forget tomorrow. It was supposed to entertain him, but it only made the silence louder. He dropped the phone on the side table and picked up a book. Reading always helped before, but tonight, even the printed words felt empty. They sat there, cold and lifeless, refusing to sink into his brain. He closed the book and let it fall onto the bed with a dull thud. Minutes crawled by. He checked the clock again. 1:26 a.m. The night had barely moved. Kabir decided to make tea just for something to do. The kitchen was colder than his room, the tiles icy against his bare feet. The sound of the kettle boiling broke the monotony for a while, filling the silence with a hiss like a whispering ghost. He made the tea, held the cup between his hands, and stared at the steam rising into the air. He stood there for a long time, watching it swirl and vanish, just like everything else in life. Back in his room, he sat on the edge of the bed, sipping slowly, feeling the warmth spread through his body. But it wasn't enough. Nothing was enough tonight. The silence had teeth now. It bit into him with every passing second. He turned on the TV for company, flipping through channels showing reruns of shows he didn't care about. The actors laughed, cried, kissed, living lives that felt more real than his own. He turned it off after a while. The noise was worse than the quiet. The clock struck 3 a.m. Kabir laughed softly, a sound that felt strange in the emptiness. His laughter echoed against the walls, making the room seem even bigger, even lonelier. He wondered what it would feel like to step outside, to walk down those empty streets, to disappear into the night like a shadow. But he didn't move. His body was tired, Even if his mind wasn't, he sat by the window again, watching the night sky. The stars looked like distant eyes, watching silently as he unraveled. He whispered to them, though he didn't know why or what he hoped for. Maybe that someone, somewhere, would hear him. Maybe that the night would finally take pity and let him sleep. But it didn't. The darkness stayed heavy. His thoughts grew heavier. He thought about his childhood, about promises he made to himself when he was younger, about the dreams that now lay in pieces like broken glass. He thought about the people he loved and lost, about the words he never said, the calls he never made, the chances he let slip away. Each memory was a stone, and soon he felt like he was drowning under their weight. He lay back down, staring at the ceiling fan again. It spun lazily, like time itself mocking him. He closed his eyes once more, counted numbers in his head, whispered fragments of prayers he hadn't said in years. But nothing worked. Sleep was cruel, standing at the edge of his world, watching but never stepping in. When dawn finally came, Kabir didn't feel relief. The night had ended, but its shadow stayed inside him. He hadn't slept at all, and yet he felt like he had traveled miles through memories, regrets, and questions that had no answers. He watched the sunlight creep across the floor, painting everything gold, and for the first time in hours, he smiled. Not because he felt better, but because he had survived another endless night. Fifth number story. A night without end. The night began like a whisper, soft, almost gentle, yet it carried a weight that pressed against Kabir's chest like an invisible hand. Outside his window, the city had surrendered to darkness. The lights of distant apartments flickered like stars scattered on earth, but even those seemed tired, ready to fade away. The streets below were empty, the air still, except for the occasional sigh of wind brushing against the trees. And in the middle of this silence sat Kabir, wide awake, staring at the ceiling as if the answers to all his questions were hidden in its cracks. He lay in bed, the sheets twisted around him like restless thoughts. The fan above spun lazily, making that low, monotonous hum that usually lulled him into sleep, but not tonight. Tonight, the sound grated against his nerves, each rotation like a reminder of time crawling forward in cruel slow motion. He turned to look at the clock on the wall. The hands glowed faintly in the darkness, pointing to 11:47 p.m., only minutes away from midnight. Yet the night already felt endless. Kabir closed his eyes, willing himself to drift away. He tried to imagine the comfort of sleep, the weightlessness, the fading of thought, the surrender. But the harder he tried, the further it slipped away. His mind was a storm, churning with memories he didn't want, questions that had no answers, and fears that grew louder when the world went quiet. He sat up with a sigh that sounded too loud in the stillness. His throat was dry, his body heavy with fatigue, and yet his mind felt sharp, alert, mercilessly awake. He swung his legs off the bed and walked to the window. The floor was cold beneath his bare feet. He pushed the curtains aside and stared into the night. The street below was drenched in a pale orange glow from the lampposts, casting long, skeletal shadows on the pavement. A stray dog moved silently, its figure dissolving into the darkness like a ghost. Far in the distance, a siren wailed faintly, a sound so distant it might have been a memory. Kabir leaned against the window frame, breathing in the cold air that slipped through the small gap in the glass. The night smelled of rain, though the clouds were nowhere to be seen. He wondered how the world could feel so alive during the day, bursting with noise and chaos, and yet so utterly hollow at night. It was as if the city had two faces, one that laughed under the sun and one that stared blankly into the void under the moon. He walked back to the bed, picked up his phone, and unlocked it. The harsh blue light hit his eyes, making them ache, but he scrolled anyway. Photos, videos, meaningless words. People smiling at beaches, eating at restaurants, posting quotes about happiness. All of it felt staged, like a play where everyone knew their lines except him. He scrolled for what felt like hours, but when he looked at the clock again, it was only 12:19 a.m. Kabir laughed softly, a dry, humorless sound that echoed in the emptiness. He dropped the phone onto the pillow and reached for the book on his nightstand. Reading had always been his refuge, but tonight even the words betrayed him. They blurred before his eyes, refusing to make sense. He read the same line again and again until the letters seemed to crawl off the page and scatter into the shadows. With a frustrated sigh, he closed the book and let it slip from his hands. The room felt smaller now, the walls inching closer, the air thicker. He stood up and walked to the kitchen, craving movement, craving distraction. The tiles were ice cold beneath his feet, and the hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. He opened it and stared at the contents as if expecting to find something more than food. Bottles of water, leftover curry, a half-empty jar of pickles, nothing that could fill the void gnawing at him. He grabbed a bottle of water and drank deeply, feeling the cold trickle down his throat. For a moment, it felt good. For a moment, he felt alive that he made tea next, more out of ritual than desire. The sound of the kettle boiling filled the silence like a distant song. He watched the steam rise in delicate spirals, disappearing into the dark like fleeting dreams. He carried the cup back to his room and sat by the window, sipping slowly. Outside, the night seemed endless, a black ocean stretching in every direction. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time had lost meaning. The clock said 2:08 a.m. Kabir felt like he had lived a lifetime in the span of a few hours. His thoughts grew heavier now, darker. They pulled him into places he didn't want to go, memories of people he loved and lost, of words he wished he had said, of mistakes that clung to him like scars. The silence of the night amplified everything, turning whispers into screams. He stood at the window again, staring at the faint glimmer of stars. They looked cold, distant, uncaring. He whispered something. He wasn't sure what. A prayer, maybe. A plea. His voice cracked, and for a moment, he felt the sting of tears behind his eyes. But they didn't fall. They never did. The night dragged on, merciless and unending. The clock struck 3, then 4. Kabir felt his body sinking, his thoughts unraveling like loose threads. He lay back on the bed, exhausted but wide awake. He counted backward from 100, tried breathing exercises, even spoke aloud to himself just to hear a human voice. Nothing worked. Sleep was a cruel stranger, standing at the door but refusing to enter. When the first light of dawn finally broke, painting the sky in shades of pale gold, Kabir felt no relief. The night was over, but its shadow lingered inside him like a stain that couldn't be washed away. He closed his eyes one last time, and as the world outside woke up to a new day, he finally surrendered, not to peace, but to a heavy, dreamless sleep that felt more like defeat than rest. Sixth story of Boring Story series. Let's start with story title The Night That Refused to Die. The night began as all nights do. Quiet, unassuming, a soft blanket drawn over the restless body of the world. But this night was different, though Kabir didn't know it yet. To him, it was just another evening stretching into darkness, another attempt to chase the illusion of rest. He switched off the lights, lay down on his bed, and pulled the blanket over himself. The fan above spun slowly, its rhythmic hum blending with the distant sounds of the city, horns fading into silence, footsteps vanishing into alleyways, voices dissolving into whispers that it was supposed to be simple. Close his eyes, drift into dreams, wake to the morning light. But simplicity is a fragile thing, and tonight it shattered like glass beneath his thoughts. Kabir stared at the ceiling, tracing imaginary patterns in the faint glow leaking through the curtains. He shifted on the bed, turning from one side to the other, searching for comfort that wasn't there. His body was tired, but his mind, oh, his mind was alive, electric, burning with questions he didn't want to ask. Why did he feel so hollow? Why did the silence weigh more than any noise ever could? Why, in a life so full of things, did everything feel empty? The clock on the wall ticked, each second falling like a drop of water into a deep, dry well. 11:38 p.m. Still early. Still time to sleep. He closed his eyes and breathed slowly. Inhale. Exhale. Again. Again. But the darkness behind his eyelids only amplified the noise inside his head. Fragments of conversations, faces of people he had known, roads he had walked, all flashing like broken film reels. He sat up with a sigh, his breath heavy in the cold air of the room. He rubbed his face with his hands, feeling the roughness of unshaven stubble against his palms. The night pressed against him like an uninvited guest, settling into every corner of his room, every corner of his mind. Kabir reached for his phone. Its glow sliced through the darkness like a blade. Notifications blinked, messages from people he didn't care to answer, updates from apps he didn't need, headlines about a world spinning out of control. He scrolled without purpose, his thumb moving mechanically, his eyes glazing over. Pictures of smiling faces, laughing strangers, vacations, weddings, achievements, all staged, all painted, all hollow. He felt a sharp pang in his chest, not envy, not longing, something worse. A nameless ached. He put the phone down and picked up the book on his nightstand. Its pages felt cool, its words familiar. Reading had always been his escape, but tonight the letters refused to stay still. They danced and blurred, taunting him. He read the same line 5 times and couldn't remember a single word. With a frustrated groan, he tossed the book aside. The clock now read 12:14 a.m. Midnight had arrived, not with mystery or magic, but with a heavy silence that filled the room like smoke. Kabir stood up. The floor was cold beneath his feet, and the chill seeped into his bones. He walked to the window and pulled the curtains apart. The world outside was drenched in a strange, colorless light. The street was empty, except for the occasional flicker of a dying lamppost. Shadows stretched like long fingers across the pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, its voice hollow, echoing off walls like a warning. Kabir leaned against the glass, feeling the faint vibration of the wind. It whispered against the pane, soft and eerie, as if the night itself was breathing. He thought about stepping outside, walking down the empty street, disappearing into the dark. The thought lingered, sweet and dangerous. But he stayed where he was, a prisoner of his own stillness. He turned back into the room, restless, his mind a storm. He opened the fridge, stared at its contents. A bottle of water, leftover food, a half-empty jar of something he couldn't even remember buying. He grabbed the water and drank deeply, the cold liquid burning down his throat like ice. But it didn't quench the thirst he felt, not for water, but for something he couldn't name. That he made tea, watching the steam curl and vanish like smoke from a dying fire. He held the cup in both hands, feeling the warmth seep into his skin, grounding him, anchoring him. But the weight inside his chest didn't lift. It sat there, heavy, immovable, like a stone at the bottom of a well. The clock read 2:03 a.m. The night stretched on, merciless, infinite. Kabir sat by the window, sipping his tea in silence. He thought about his past, the things he had done, the things he hadn't. He thought about the faces of people who had walked away, about promises broken and dreams abandoned. The memories came like ghosts, one by one, sitting with him in the dark, their voices soft and cruel. By 3:47 a.m., Kabir felt hollowed out, as if the night had carved pieces out of him with invisible hands. He whispered to himself, fragments of prayers, fragments of curses. His voice sounded strange in the stillness, like someone else speaking. He lay down again, eyes burning, heart pounding. He counted numbers, whispered lullabies to himself, even cried without tears. But sleep refused to come. It stood at the edge of the room, a shadow with cold eyes, watching, waiting, never stepping closer. When dawn finally broke, painting the horizon with pale light, Kabir felt no relief. The sun rose, but the night inside him didn't end. It stayed, stitched into his bones, a weight he would carry into the day. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to escape the light. And in that strange, broken moment, he wondered if some nights never truly end, if they live inside us, forever, whispering their silence into every corner of our lives. What should I do next? Kindly comment, like, share, and also subscribe my channel.